Hi everyone. I'm Jack. I'm a member of the Platypus Affiliated Society. We have a chapter here at the ENS, maybe Paris more broadly. Platypus was created in 2006 to. I don't need this. Okay. Where was it? Yeah, we were created in 2006, 2007, 6, to investigate the history of the left and the possibilities in the present for reconstituting a Marxian left. Our slogan is, "The left is dead, long live the left." We have coffee breaks here at ENS every Wednesday at 6 o'clock in the Petit Pot cafeteria, and we're currently running a reading group, a short course, Introduction to Platypus, every Thursday at 5 o'clock, also in the Petit Pot. Sometimes we move outside because it's getting nice out. And yeah, we'll be hopefully hosting a panel sometime in April, so stay tuned for that, and please come to our coffee breaks. And coffee breaks just like an informal setting to talk about the left and all things to do with the left. So I am tasked with giving a teach-in on imperialism in the left. So I'm just going to deliver some prepared remarks. There's a lot here. I only really want to talk about for about like an hour 15. So feel free to jump in with questions at any time. I don't really want to talk for that long. I don't have to get through everything. Do as much as I can. Just a few words about the teach-in. It's inspired. It's coming out of a reading group that a few members of Platypus participated in on imperialism a few months ago. So I just wanted to thank everyone that was participating in that reading group, and especially the pedagogues, Danny and Spencer. I'm very humbly trying to reproduce at least some of the conversations and insight from that reading group. Okay. So it's kind of split up into two parts. The first is almost like a book report on the reading group, and the second is a kind of a deeper reflection on, I guess, where the left is today in history and where Platypus is today in history. All right. We good? All right. Imperialism in the left, and this first section is Marx and the liberal critique of bonapartism imperialism. In the aftermath of the Revolution of 1848, Karl Marx theorized the emergence of global imperialism. But to characterize Marx as a theorist of imperialism raises more questions than it answers. For one, it cuts against the received wisdom on the left, according to which the defining features of imperialism center around colonization, finance capital, interstate competition, capitalist war, etc. While these phenomena existed to a degree in the mid-19th century when Marx was theorizing imperialism, the capitalism of the mid-19th century differed significantly from the capitalism of the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries, the period traditionally associated with imperialism. Yet both Marx and the leaders of the Second International, his students, understood themselves to be living in imperialism. So, in what sense could Marx speak of imperialism post-1848? Take the case of colonialism. By the middle of the 19th century, Britain, the most significant colonial power in the world, hardly resembled the expansionist power it would become by the century's end. On the contrary, mainstream political opinion in Britain seemed largely opposed to maintaining its colonies, including the empire's crown jewel, India. As Benjamin Disraeli famously wrote in an 1852 letter, quote, "These wretched colonies will all be independent too in a few years, and are a millstone around our necks," unquote. That a leading Tory politician could express such a sentiment seemed to reflect the triumph of the Manchester School, the movement that, with its base of middle class and not insignificant working class support in industrial Manchester, upheld the ideals of classical liberalism, one of which being the reform, or, if need be, abolition of the colonies. With palpable sympathy, Marx described the outlook of the Manchester School as such. The struggle of the Manchester School against the old, quote, the struggle of the Manchester School against the old English institutions, products of a superannuated and evanescent stage of social development, is resumed in the watchword: produce as cheap as you can and do away with all the faux frais of production, with all superfluous, unnecessary expenses in production. And this watchword is addressed not only to the private individual, but to the nation at large, principally. Royalty, with its barbarous splendors, its court, its civil list, and its flunkies, what else does it belong to but to the faux frais of production? The nation can produce and exchange without royalty. Away with the crown. The sinecures of the nobility, the House of Lords, faux frais of production. The large standing army, faux frais of production. The colonies, faux frais of production. The state church, with its riches, the spoils of plunder or of mendacity, faux frais of production. Let parsons compete freely with each other, and everyone pay them according to his own wants. The whole circumstantial routine of English law with its court of chicanery, faux frais of production. National wars, faux frais of production. England can exploit foreign nations more cheaply while at peace with them. Okay, so that's how Marx is kind of describing, the Manchester School taking up kind of revolutionary bourgeois liberalism, right? And from the standpoint of which the colonialism is, more than not faux frais of production, right? A sentiment that's more or less, affirmed by, pretty much all parties in Britain around 1850. Colonialism appears outdated, yet Marx views post-1848 Britain as one expression of imperialism. Even putting aside the remarkable indifference of England's political classes towards the colonies, the characterization of imperialism at first appears odd for 19th century Britain, a much more liberal country than Bonaparte's Second Empire, which seems a much more straightforward and perhaps the sole referent for the term imperialism. Yet the bourgeois revolution in Britain, as around the world, had come into crisis. The proletarianization of society, brought about by the first industrial revolution of the early 19th century, threw the entire project of modern freedom, and with it, bourgeois radical thought, into crisis. Bourgeois society's crisis had paradoxically developed in tandem with events that appeared to represent the advance of bourgeois society. For example, the repeal of the Corn Laws, the adoption of the first Reform Bill, and the rise of genuinely bourgeois political formations, namely Manchesterism and Chartism. Chartism is kind of like the first working class party, in opposition to the, quote, superannuated and aristocratic Whigs and Tories. Despite its apparent flourishing in mid-century Britain, Manchester was not to be the realization of liberalism, but rather its last great, yet increasingly self-contradictory holdout. Unlike the rest of Europe, Britain did not have a revolution in 1848. Instead, that year marked the beginning of the defeat of Chartism. In the aftermath of 1840, Chartism as kind of like a radical working class party. Okay. It's defeated in 1848. In the aftermath of 1848, the power of the British state increased considerably relative to Parliament and civil society. The unelected cabinet, and the bureaucracy were strengthened at the expense of Parliament, where the exercise of public reason became more and more constrained. For instance, Parliament could not, or perhaps didn't dare, hold serious debates on fundamental questions like the renewal of the charter of the British East India Company, and instead increasingly delegated its responsibilities to the cabinet and the sprawling civil service. The increasing separation of the state from society was most acutely expressed in the events of the Second Opium War, which was, in Marx's words, quote, undertaken on the arbitrary behest of Lord Palmerston, unquote. In other words, without the knowledge or consent of Parliament and the public. Palmerston is the Prime Minister of Britain throughout most of the 1850s. During that war, Palmerston would conclude an agreement with Louis Bonaparte, establishing an Anglo-French alliance that, from 1858 to 60, led an expedition ending with the Qing dynasty granting various land and trade concessions to England, France, and Tsarist Russia. The war shocked liberal society. Here was parliamentary, post-reform England, led by a Whig prime minister no less, waging an unsanctioned, scandalous war of aggression against a largely defenseless population in concert with the two most reactionary regimes in Europe. For Marx, the profound political and social changes of the 1850s and 60s were part of stabilizing the global capitalist order in the wake of the failed revolutions of 1848. Stabilization didn't mean inertia or reverting to a pre-48 world. No, the revolution's demands were to be met, but in the most contradictory, conservative ways. Italian unification was to be managed through war between France, Austria, and Russia. The bringing of China into commercial society achieved through brutal war conducted by an unholy alliance between France, England, and Russia. The development of capitalism in Germany, accomplished by redirecting revolutionary fervor toward commerce and industry, etc., etc. In this respect, Marx could regard Palmerston's regime as no less an expression of the global post-1848 capitalist world state. Regarding France, Marx grasped the development of revolutionary new industrial and financial institutions under Bonaparte as the contradictory product of the failures of the 1848 revolution. The demands for a social republic, raised by the Parisian proletariat in the June days, were seemingly made good on in the boardroom of the new joint stock company, the Crédit Mobilier, where the expropriation of the bourgeoisie and the socialization of production were deliberately pursued in order to, quote, save property from the dangers of socialism. Right? How are you going to save property? You're going to destroy it. Such a puzzling development accorded with Bonaparte's equally contradictory brand of politics. Marx wrote that, quote, it should be recollected that Bonaparte made his coup d'etat on two diametrically opposite pretenses. On the one, proclaiming it was his mission to save the bourgeoisie and material order from the Red Anarchy, to be let loose in May 1852, and on the other hand, to save the working people from the bourgeois despotism concentrated in the National Assembly. Right? So Bonaparte's playing both sides. Right? He's promising the workers one thing and the bourgeoisie another. The Crédit Mobilier was the early forerunner to the gargantuan financial institutions that became the central organs of world capitalism at the end of the 19th century. Interestingly, it was the idea of Émile and Isaac Pereire, two Saint-Simonian socialists, no less. Marx saw in the Crédit Mobilier, quote, one of the most curious economic phenomena out of our time, unquote, and one of the, quote, symptoms of the general convulsion of society manifesting themselves throughout Europe. Seemingly defeated in June 1848, the revolution was nevertheless being carried out, not by the proletariat, who was not ready to rule, nor by the bourgeoisie, who could no longer rule, but by Bonaparte, who simultaneously ruled in the interests of everyone and no one. Only somewhat enigmatically, Marx termed the regime of Louis Bonaparte, quote, imperial or bonapartist socialism. It ought to be stressed that Marx was not alone in recognizing the regressive character of the post-48 global political order. Marx's writings from the 1850s and 60s are brilliant, but hardly unique examples of what were, at base, liberal critiques of Bonapartism. Surrounding the parliamentary debate and vote on the 1853 renewal of the East India Company Charter, liberal individuals and civil society organizations in Britain, and notably in India, waged a concerted campaign against the Charter's renewal, insisting that the, quote, voice of the natives needed to be heard before any decision could be made. There was also the question of the ever-increasing bureaucratic autonomy of the company, which the liberals demanded be subordinated to parliamentary control. This recalled and rehearsed the proposal made by radical Whig, an avid supporter of the American Revolution, and the then Foreign Secretary, Charles James Fox, in 1783, to subordinate the company to the will of Parliament. In 1857, the debates around the Second Opium War, parliamentary ones, which Marx attended as a journalist, evinced a similar high liberal, high Enlightenment character. However, the results in both cases were bitterly disappointing. Despite the liberal opposition, the charter was renewed, the company's bureaucracy expanded, Palmerston re-elected, and the exploitation of China and India continued with frightening vigor. On the House of Commons floor, on the floor of the House of Commons, Manchester liberals John Bright and Richard Cobden would invoke the high ideals of the radical Enlightenment in their critiques of Palmerston's dictatorship, parliamentary dictatorship. The parliamentary debates over India and China were, quote, great in Marx's estimation. They were great. However, Bright and Cobden appeared impotent in the face of the profound political changes brought on by industrialization. Bright and Cobden's liberalism, not themselves. Besides, their bourgeois radicalism was outdated. Mass proletarianization meant that the project of Smithian liberalism could no longer be straightforwardly advanced. One could no longer speak of the exportation of bourgeois society as representing progress because bourgeois society had itself entered into a historical crisis, which Marx termed capital. Commenting on John Bright's free trade critique of the company, Marx wrote that, quote, Mr. Bright's picture of India, ruined by the fiscal exertions of the company and government, did not, of course, receive the supplement of India ruined by Manchester and free trade. In other words, after the 1830s, 1840s, it's not just like the mercantile company that's ruining India, right? It's Manchester and free trade, right? It's bourgeois society doing it. Bourgeois society's crisis. Marx took it for granted, to kind of sum up, right? Marx took it for granted that post-1848 social life was fundamentally bound up with the failed revolutions of 1848. Bonapartism, or imperialism, the two were synonymous for Marx, was not a bolt from the blue or independent of the class struggle. It was the contradictory form that a world overripe for socialism necessarily took. Imperialist socialism was the dialectical inverse of the dictatorship of the proletariat and expressed negatively the necessity of the latter. Okay, the next section is imperialism and international social democracy, mutually penetrating opposites. Okay, from 1905 to 1914, imperialism became one of the leading, if not the most important, questions on which the revisionist dispute hinged. By the turn of the 20th century, it was clear that specific fundamental shifts in capitalism were taking place. For one, liberalism, although having been diagnosed by Marx half a century earlier as already in crisis following 1848, had still constituted itself as a viable political force in Europe and the US, was in severe, irreversible decline everywhere. In Britain, the bastion of liberalism, free trade, once the clarion call of British liberals since the 18th century, was now considered anachronistic, unable to advance the interests of the nation and British industry, whose position in the world market was increasingly threatened by the rapidly developing United States and Germany. To prevent British manufacturers from being outcompeted by cheaper American and German goods in colonial markets, a system of protective tariffs was set up throughout the British Empire, permitting the colonies to trade freely only with Britain. This turn toward protectionism embodied bourgeois society's self-contradiction in the era of imperialism. Free trade would now exist in a most perverse form, alongside the strictest protectionism. Just as a world system of protective tariffs replaced bourgeois free trade, the liberal critique of colonies as faux frais, although retaining currency throughout the 1850s and 60s, stood impotent in the face of the brutal colonization of Asia and Africa by the large capitalist countries. Capitalism, more specifically politics in capitalism, was clearly changing. Imperialism was establishing what Kautsky called, quote, Karl Kautsky, the leader of the SPD, theoretician of the SPD, called new style exploitation colonies, which differed from the old exploitation colonies and the historically progressive work colonies as outlets for the exportation of capital, i.e. for the exportation of the ongoing social crisis in the mother countries. The new Weltpolitik, world politics in German, represented a deepening of the crisis of bourgeois society. Across the world, the state was strengthened, political repression and violence in the colonies increased, nationalism replaced cosmopolitanism, protectionism, free trade, monopoly and trusts, competition. Public reason and the press degenerated, and the threat of world war rose menacingly. The old bourgeois liberal parties, for example, the Republican Party in the US and the Liberal Party in Britain, were either rendered impotent or actively participated in imperialism. J.A. Hobson, who worked for The Guardian as a frontline reporter during the Second Boer War, bitterly described the end-of-the-century collapse of liberalism in his magnum opus, Imperialism, a Study. This is Hobson on the collapse of liberalism. In Germany, France, and Italy, the Liberal Party, as a factor in practical politics, has either disappeared or is reduced to impotence. In England, it now stands convicted of a gross, palpable betrayal of the first conditions of liberty, feebly fumbling after programs as a substitute for principles. Its leaders, having sold their party to a confederacy of stock gamblers and jingo sentimentalists, find themselves impotent to defend free trade, free press, free schools, free speech, or any of the rudiments of ancient liberalism. They have alienated the confidence of the people. For many years, they have been permitted to conduct a sham fight and to call it politics. The people thought it real until the South African War furnished a decisive dramatic test, and the unreality of liberalism became apparent. I'll skip a bit. This surrender to imperialism signifies that they have preferred the economic interests of the possessing and speculative classes, to which most of their leaders belong, to the cause of liberalism. That they are not conscious traitors or hypocrites may be readily conceded, but the fact remains that they have sold the cause of popular reform, which was their rightful heritage, for an imperialism which appealed to their business interests and their social prepossessions. A liberal party can only survive as a discredited or feeble remnant in England, unless it consents definitely to dissever itself from that imperialism which its past leaders, as well as their opponents, have permitted to block the progress of domestic reforms. Hobson's work on imperialism is a phenomenal work of liberal social thought and was one of the highlights of the reading group for me. Lenin hardly had a negative thing to say about it, save for its petty bourgeois democratic conclusion that, quote, thus alone is it possible that a strong rally of liberals might, by fusion or cooperation with the political organizations of the working classes, fight imperialism with the only effectual weapon, social reconstruction on the basis of democracy. Unquote. For Hobson, imperialism could be opposed by the working class through its trade unions and democratic participation, forcing the state to redistribute the overaccumulated capital that forced the capitalist class to seek profits in the colonies. Seek profits in the colonies and create the colonies in the first place. In any case, with Hobson's study of imperialism, as with Cobden and Bright's opposition to British imperial policy in India and China in the 1850s, we are presented with a far-ranging and principled liberal critique of bonapartism and imperialism at the very moment when liberalism appears least able to constitute itself as a viable political alternative to imperialism. What I'm underscoring here, as I tried to do in the section about Marx, is that there is a liberal category of imperialism and also a fundamentally liberal critique of imperialism. Imperialism is not an outgrowth of liberalism, as I think much of the left believes it is. Quite the contrary. Imperialism violates liberalism and was, empirically and historically, premised on liberalism's crisis, its coming into self-contradiction in the industrial era. That's why it was possible, indeed even mainstream, in Britain in the 1850s and 60s, to have a liberal critique of colonization, protectionism, monopoly, etc. Coming out of 1848, Marx recognized the inadequacy of liberal or petty bourgeois democratic anti-capitalism and saw in a politically constituted proletariat, a subject whose struggles pointed beyond one-sided liberal anti-capitalism. I'm just going to grab some water. In taking up the question of imperialism, the Second International returned to Marx's post-1848 insights in its attempt to prosecute and take responsibility for the crisis of liberalism. Writing in 1899 about the Boer War, which, alongside the American participation in the Spanish-American War, was understood by both Hobson and Marxism to have marked the true beginnings of imperialism, Kautsky narrated this relationship, the relationship between liberalism, what he calls Manchesterism, and proletarian socialism. Quote, but that the dragging on of the Boer War would mean a hard blow for that tendency that arose in England alongside socialism out of the wreckage of Manchesterism, and that today competes with socialism for mastery over the minds of the English proletariat, imperialism. Right. So ostensibly the dragging on of the Boer War, which is really violent for England, it doesn't initially at least do a very good job of defeating the Boers. It should mean the conquering of imperialism, right? But in addition to socialism, another power arose from the decline of Manchesterism, imperialism. Driven by the needs of the ruling classes, imperialism is making even more rapid progress than socialism among the English people, and is today the primary means of arresting the development of the latter. Thus, Kautsky understood socialism and imperialism as developing alongside each other out of the ruins of Manchesterism, i.e. liberalism. Kautsky grasped imperialism as not something entirely opposed to or fundamentally different from the socialist movement, but produced by the latter in order to quash it. The revolution was demanding its opposite. This recalls Marx's understanding of the initial emergence of bonapartism post-1848 as one of the symptoms of the general convulsion of society manifesting itself throughout Europe. That was a quote. At the end of the 19th century, the Marxism of the Second International, in self-consciously expressing the general convulsion of society, transformed and was itself transformed by imperialism. In the same article, Kautsky wrote, quote, "The system of free trade, not merely the import of commodities without protective duties, but Manchesterism and laissez-faire became untenable. From a proletarian standpoint, the consequence of this breakdown should have been the transition to socialism, and therefore, first of all, the strengthening of the socialist movement. Among the workers, however, one could have expected that Manchesterist views would be replaced by socialist ones, precisely in the field of foreign policy, especially colonial policy, where they, Manchesterism and socialism, liberalism and socialism, differ the least. Like the Manchesterists, the proletariat is also a decisive opponent of wars of conquest, of exploitation and oppression, in the colonies no less than at home, as well as a decisive supporter of free international exchange and the abolition of national rivalries." Liberalism and socialism share this, right? To our bitter disappointment, the present mood in England shows us how much imperialism has also taken possession of the proletariat. That's in 1899, right? The considerable nationalism and support for the Boer War expressed by English socialists and parts of the English working class appears to Kautsky as a serious problem, but perhaps just a uniquely English problem. Right? So he kind of explains it by like, Engels wrote this thing in 1885 saying that, England had a monopoly on the world market and maybe it was using some of the profits of its monopoly to kind of politically pay off the workers. Right? And this is kind of getting into Lenin's labor aristocracy. I don't want to do that. I think it's a pretty debased conversation today, but we can talk about that in the Q&A maybe. Okay, so for Kautsky, maybe it's just an English problem, right? Maybe it's just because England has a world monopoly. However, in the coming years, imperialism would prove to take possession not only of the English working classes, but also of international social democracy in general. All right, next section. How are we doing? Okay, next section is 1907, the Hottentot elections and the Stuttgart Conference. We're getting into the weeds here, people. But it'll be good. We'll come out the other side. 1907 was a pivotal year in the history of the Second International. January saw the SPD lose, that's the Socialist Party in Germany. The SPD lose nearly half its parliamentary seats in what's known as the Hottentot elections, named after the years-long genocidal campaign waged by the German Empire against the Herero and Nama peoples of southern Africa. The elections, called after Parliament had been dissolved by the German Chancellor for refusing to grant the government an increased military budget, were billed as a national referendum on the Kaiserreich's plans for a German Weltpolitik, a world politics, an imperial politics. Standing alone as the only party to oppose the Kaiser's imperial ambitions, the SPD suffered a crushing electoral defeat. The resonant clamors of jingoism, ringing from every province and class, drowned out the proletarian cry of not one man, not one penny. Before 1907, the SPD's support had only grown, and the party showed no signs of equivocation on the colonial question, gaining a reputation for being the most fervently anti-imperialist section of the Second International. However, at the International Congress in Stuttgart in August 1907, a split appeared within the German delegation over the question of socialist colonial policy. A narrowly defeated proposal stating that, quote, the Congress does not reject colonial policy in principle and for all time, since it could operate as a civilizing factor under a socialist regime, unquote, was backed by a majority of the German delegates and occasioned an ideological battle between the left and the right within the SPD and, more generally, international social democracy. So there's this question of what would it mean to have a socialist colonial policy is raised in 1907 after the SPD loses this election, right? And the election is like about imperialism, right? So the kind of right wing of the SPD is going to say, well, we need to take a less principled, more moderate stance, right? Otherwise, we're just going to lose the people, right? Okay. The problem within the English working class that Kautsky had observed 8 years earlier was seemingly being generalized, even infecting the crown jewel of the Second International, the SPD. Lenin ominously characterized the debate at the Stuttgart conference as, quote, revealing a negative feature in the European labor movement, one that can do no little harm to the proletarian cause, and for that reason should receive serious attention. Kautsky's 1907 pamphlet, Socialism and Colonial Policy, perhaps the authoritative text on colonialism produced by the Second International, answered Lenin's calls for a Marxist critique of Marxism, right? That this problem should receive serious attention. This problem in Marxism needs a Marxist to come and give it serious attention. Written as an intervention in the debates within the SPD that had come to the fore at Stuttgart, the pamphlet attempted to make sense of the split within social democracy that had now formed over the question of colonial policy. Polemicizing against the revisionists, Kautsky wrote, quote, he who is not able to see the logical consistency of this view fails also to understand the nature of the whole of social democracy, which likewise consists in this, that one can fight capitalism, negate it, demand its complete abolition, and yet at the same time seek positive reforms within it. This combination of positive and negative struggle, which we pursue with regard to the whole of capitalism, is also valid for each of its component phenomena. German social democracy has always acted in this way on colonial policy as well. The debates at Stuttgart were thus an extension and deepening of the decade-long revisionist dispute. Since the final years of the 19th century, a reformist tendency had emerged from within Marxism that sought not to overcome capitalism, but perhaps more to manage and stabilize it. Although they didn't confess that, right? They wouldn't concede to that. At Stuttgart, in failing to oppose the new colonial policy of the capitalist state with proletarian revolution, which had always been the Marxist position, the revisionists had shown their true colors. In the new era of finance capital and colonial empires, Marxism seemed to be making a bid for the leadership of the bonapartist state. For this reason, Kautsky was particularly dismayed by the lack of attention paid to the debates at Stuttgart, which were treated as a, quote, mere squabble over words. For Kautsky, the international competition of the state capitalist trusts portended a brewing civilizational crisis, which was necessarily transforming and throwing into crisis the politics of international social democracy. It was no coincidence that the emergence of revisionism coincided with that of imperialism. Nor should it be lost on us that it's precisely this understanding of the inseparability of the socialist movement and capitalism that informed Lenin's dating of imperialism to no earlier than 1898, right? Not the 17th century, not early Renaissance Europe, not the 18th century, the end of the 19th century, all the way to the end of the 19th century. As Danny Jacobs put it in his teaching on anti-imperialism and anti-fascism, quote, one of Lenin's earliest mentions of imperialism came in his plan of a lecture on the Commune. This is what Lenin wrote. Foundations of imperialism. The bourgeoisie no longer, the proletariat not yet. This was a direct reference, I'm still quoting Danny Jacobs, this was a direct reference to the passage in Marx's Civil War in France, where he gives an account of the Second Empire under Napoleon III. And yet, 11 years later, Lenin would write that, quote, neither Marx nor Engels lived to see the imperialist epoch of world capitalism, which began not earlier than 1898 to 1900. What had changed? Between Marx and Engels' time, an international party with Marxism at its head had emerged, the Second International. This had qualitatively transformed capitalism. The situation where the bourgeoisie no longer, the proletariat could not yet rule, had not been overcome but transformed, changed and deepened. The Second International was the embodiment of this problem. All right. New section. Imperialism and the high crisis of Marxism. In 1915, Lenin remarked how, quote, the objective conditions of the end of the 19th century exceptionally intensified opportunism, unquote. The specifically Marxist understanding of this new epoch of capitalism, imperialism, was wholly bound up with, made possible by, the political crisis within international social democracy, which, as Danny said, was the embodiment of this problem. It should come as no surprise, then, that the great theoretical works of the Second International on imperialism were all published after the Stuttgart Conference of 1907. In the throes of the Civil War in Marxism, imperialism was transformed from a descriptive, passive, and one-sidedly objective category into a critical, active, and subjective category that centered the socio-political activity of the working class. Hobson's work on imperialism is of an altogether different character and genre than the works of Lenin, Luxemburg, Kautsky, etc. Hobson, devoid of a socialist party in Britain that could embody the problem, perhaps for that reason, one-sidedly presents imperialism as wholly opposed to bourgeois society. He simply cannot think of imperialism as arising from the working class's struggle in capitalism. Instead, he posits a more economic, more objective explanation, namely, actually, I don't need to do Hobson's thesis here. Okay, he gives a kind of economic, objective explanation, right? There's an overaccumulation of savings, and it's going into the capitalist class's pockets, and they don't have anywhere to productively invest this, so they go abroad, and then there's all these negative consequences, right? And he thinks what's the remedy for this? It's democracy, right? But what he's not seeing is that democracy is a symptom, right? It's how the crisis is reproducing itself. It's producing itself through the bonapartist state. It's producing itself through democracy. The left today, in giving sophisticated economic explanations of imperialism, it's about oil, finance capital, overaccumulation of capital, etc., not only disavows the Marxist understanding of imperialism as constituted in and through the class-conscious proletariat, but in doing so, betrays a profound pessimism about the possibility of ever reconstituting such a subject. Instead of proletarian politics transforming capitalism, imperialism gets reified into the natural state of things, which one can only resist, presumably for all eternity. On the recent, so we just had two panels in London and in Georgetown. And I think maybe 5 of the 6 panelists, they're just like, they just assume that we're still in imperialism, right? Like 2025, of course, right? This is Lenin's time, right? On the UCL panel a few weeks ago, Mike McNair of the CPGB characterized as absurd the orthodox Marxist dating of the start of imperialism to the end of the 19th century. Instead, McNair projected the rise of imperialism all the way back to the Italian city-states of the early Renaissance. But this falls below the level of not only Hobson, who shared Marxism's historical specificity, but also the, quote, leading British bourgeois politicians, unquote, during the era of imperialism, who, Lenin observed, saw the connection between what might be called the purely economic and the socio-political roots of modern imperialism. I mean, he's not just falling below Hobson, he's falling below the high bourgeoisie, right? The capitalist class. McNair's conception of imperialism, utterly devoid of an understanding of how imperialism might point beyond itself, is an excellent example of how the left uses Marxism to rationalize and apologize for imperialism. Right? He uses Marxism because he says, like, he has all this kind of pseudo-Marxist economics explanation about, the early Italian Renaissance states is, they're developing capital, they haven't, like a banking industry, and that's leading to, like, Genoa founding sugar colonies, and it's pitched at the level of Marxism. That's what's important. But the perspective that imperialism represented the eve of revolution, which had been prepared by international social democracy, was the fundamental starting point for even the more economics-focused theories of imperialism. Rudolf Hilferding's finance capital and Rosa Luxemburg's accumulation of capital, typically consigned by the left to the dustbin of the history of Marxist economics, are unmistakably political in nature. Both Hilferding and Luxemburg offered critical accounts of imperialism as a necessary new form of capitalism, on which the clock of history could not be turned back. To emphasize this necessary character of imperialism deliberately raised the fundamental political question facing the proletariat. Without the possibility of returning to an earlier, more peaceful, non-monopolistic phase of capitalism, the question of taking responsibility for capitalism was being posed again to the proletariat. By opposing the view that imperialism was not necessary, but rather a policy choice of the bourgeoisie, Luxemburg was critiquing the revisionists, who, based on this view, concluded that the proletariat would be better served collaborating with bourgeois pacifists in promoting arms limitations than actively pursuing socialism, which Hilferding had deemed the only, quote, proletarian response to imperialism. Such a perspective, that of the revisionists, disavowing the founding principle of the Second International, namely class independence, increasingly became the position of the Marxist center faction in the SPD, reaching its highest theoretical expression in the debate surrounding the 1912 Chemnitz SPD Party Congress. So, in 1912, there's the SPD Party Congress, Chemnitz, right? And a few weeks later, there's the one at Basel, right? In Basel, it's kind of famous if you know your leftist history. They proclaim that we're going to turn everyone knows that there's going to be a world war, right? And what's the proletarian response? At Basel, there's resounding agreement. Yes, we're going to turn the world war into a civil war, right? Turn the capitalist war into a civil war. At Chemnitz, however, a few weeks before, there's this debate, is this necessarily leading to world war? Does the proletariat need to have a revolutionary independent politics? Can it kind of coerce and inform the bourgeoisie about their, pacifistic interests and, impulses, right? And interestingly enough, like economics is kind of justifying this, right? So Hilferding's work, which I think is a misreading of it, is used to kind of justify the center position at Chemnitz, right? The position that the proletariat doesn't necessarily need to oppose imperialism with revolution. All right. I'm almost done. Writing in 1915, Luxemburg drew the connection between the Second International's practical collapse a year earlier and how, in the lead-up to 1914, the chief Marxist intellectuals, in attempting to prove that imperialism wasn't necessary, that capitalist accumulation could go on ad infinitum in the capitalist countries without necessarily sparking crisis or war, Luxemburg offered this. These Marxist intellectuals had offered the supreme theoretical affirmation and justification of capitalism. As Danny Jacobs put it in his teaching, quote, by organizing the workers as a proletarian class, during the Second International, capitalism was organized in and through the ideology of Marxism, unquote. This was, of course, always a double-edged sword, right? Luxemburg summed up the SPD's crisis as such, quote, there is the closest connection between the understanding and treatment of theoretical problems and the practice of political parties over long periods. In the decade before the World War, German social democracy, as the international metropolis of proletarian intellectual life, displayed total harmony in theoretical as well as practical areas. In both areas, the same indecision and ossification appeared, and it was the same imperialism as the overwhelmingly dominant manifestation of public life which defeated the theoretical as well as the political general staff of social democracy. The proud monolithic edifice of official German social democracy was revealed at its first historical trial to be a Potemkin village. Similarly, the apparent theoretical expert knowledge and infallibility of official Marxism, which blessed every practice of the moment, turned out to be a grandiose facade hiding its inner insecurity and inability to act behind intolerant and insolent dogmatism. Luxemburg concluded with, quote, the rebellion of the ever-rising, educated, and organized working class suddenly changed into the policy of abstention on epoch-making decisions of world history and silence until the bells of peace ring out. The road to power, brilliantly illustrated down to the last detail in a period of serene peace, when there was still not a sound in the treetops, changed course straight to the road to impotence at the first gust of reality. The epigons who held the official theoretical leadership of the labor movement in the last decade bankrupted themselves at the first outbreak of the world crisis and handed leadership over to imperialism. I'm going to emphasize this part. A clear understanding of these connections is one of the essential conditions for the reconstruction of a proletarian policy which would measure up to its historical task in the period of imperialism. Thus, amid the slaughter, Luxemburg maintained that the path to realizing the proletariat's historical tasks in the period of imperialism lay in Marxism's self-critique, in advancing the proletariat's self-consciousness. Perhaps I can leave it there. Perhaps I really don't need to say anything about Lenin and how he took up the question of imperialism during World War I. But this is a teaching on imperialism, and how could I not mention Lenin? Essentially, Lenin was merely continuing, deepening the self-critique of Marxism, first elaborated during the revisionist dispute in the late 1890s. Lenin's actual contribution in the interwar years was to raise the crisis of Marxism to an unprecedented level of self-consciousness. Lenin insisted that the split within Marxism was not only now irredeemable, but, following Luxemburg, might actually constitute the very basis for the proletariat obtaining a greater clarity of its political tasks. Perhaps the proletariat had only thrown up the final obstacle of opportunism, quote, this is actually from Marx, in order to concentrate all its forces of destruction against it. Thus, the path to revolution lay not in papering over the split, which is Lenin's primary criticism of Kautsky during the war, but rather in prosecuting it fully. For Marxism, imperialism was always about the imminent critique of Marxism, because it potentially pointed beyond itself to socialism. All right, I have a little bit of time, so I have about 4.5 pages to get through. All right, this is kind of the part 2 conclusion I was talking about. It's titled The Millennial Left and the Critique of Anti-Imperialism. The millennial left emerged from the 2000s global anti-war movement against the American invasion of Iraq. From its inception, the millennial left was marked by the long shadow cast by the new left's anti-imperialism. After mainly being sidelined during the 1980s and 90s, with the millennials, Marxism reemerged. This was reflected in both the discourse at the time and the remarkable fact that the anti-war movements in the US and the UK were led by Marxist sectarian organizations, the ISO in the US and the SWP in the UK. This moment point-blankly posed the question of the continued relevance of Marxism. Many in the anti-war movement offered explanations of the causes of the invasion and occupation of Iraq in terms of capitalism and imperialism, wiping the dust off old Marxist jargon to do so. But the politics of the anti-war movement, mainly that adopted by the Marxist organizations, were deeply problematic, often amounting to nothing more than an uncritical embrace of reactionary, religious extremist groups for their supposedly striking blows against American imperialism. The Platypus-affiliated society was established in 2006, a product of the confusion and criticism that attended the anti-war movement and the reemergence of Marxism. In January 2007, we hosted our first panel titled Imperialism, What is it? Why should we be against it? In an attempt to understand why Marxism was making a reappearance on the left and how its reemergence was tied up with contemporary and historical forms of anti-imperialism. As the opening remarks of the first four panelists made clear, the millennial left was deeply ambivalent about the history of the left it was to inherit, especially regarding old and new left forms of anti-imperialism. Three of the four expressed significant misgivings, if not with anti-imperialism in general, then at least with the sort of Cliffite, the enemy of my enemy is my friend anti-imperialism, represented by the first panelist, Adam Turrell, an ISO member. That anti-imperialism was blocking the possibility of reconstituting a genuinely leftist politics was the overwhelming sentiment expressed on the panel. While the panelists openly confessed their inability to provide a concrete, coherent, alternative form of politics, in this moment they nonetheless confronted with sober senses the depth of the historical impasse the millennial left faced. As Pam Nogales put it, the millennial left's honest disorientation surrounding anti-imperialism was the basis for, quote, the beginning of an inquiry and the insistence of a task, unquote, to work through the impasse. Nick Kreitman of New SDS, organization founded in the same year as Platypus, channeled the critical consciousness of the early millennial left in his opening remarks. Kreitman said, quote, most anti-imperialists today have no program. At the anti-war marches they organize, groups like United for Peace and Justice advance no concrete alternatives. They simply hand you a sticker reading troops out now. They do not elaborate on what they want after troop withdrawal, and therefore do not connect this struggle with the question of realizing a more just society. Of course, sovereignty should rest solely with the Iraqis. Yet even as the war continues, the number of people turning out for protests dwindles because, at least in part, they can see no solution. The left needs to resume the responsibility of political leadership, which includes identifying and presenting alternatives to U.S. foreign policy. Only then can we overcome apathy. Unfortunately, the left has failed to elaborate on what could be done, on what a new Iraq might look like, just as, in the 1990s, we failed to articulate a position on how the U.S. should engage Serbia, which misled people to believe we supported Milosevic. We need people to articulate alternatives in the long term and to form concrete plans in the short term to end the occupation. Some are interested in this work, but they have not been trying hard enough to lead the movement, to provide solutions that will help us connect the people. Perhaps these remarks sound almost quaint, naive today. Chris Catrone, delivering a more negative and historically informed, but not dissimilar diagnosis of the problem, gave the following imperishable remarks. The issue of imperialism provides a good frame for investigating the present international crisis of the left. Though problematic for the left for some time, the issue of imperialism has taken on particularly grotesque forms more recently, losing whatever coherence it had in the past. Today, it betrays symptomatically the left's dearth of emancipatory imagination. The left has lost its basic orientation toward freedom, a problem going back at least as far as the 1930s. The perspective the left once had on the question and problem of freedom has been occluded in the present. Consequently, the left has largely decomposed into competing rationalizations for a bad reality that the left, in its long degeneration, has not only failed to prevent, but actually helped bring about. The sooner we stem the rot on the left, the better. But first of all, we must recognize the depth of the problem. This is why we in Platypus are dedicated to investigating the history of the left's demise, so that an imagination for social emancipation can be regained anew. The left can only survive by overcoming itself. Seriously interrogating the received political categories on the left, not least of all imperialism, is essential to establishing a coherent politics with any hope of changing the world in an emancipatory direction. That panel is now 18 years old. It is a supreme, if unsatisfying, expression of the historical consciousness and the imagination of the early millennial left. Its desire to break free from the long shadow cast by 100 years of accumulated defeats and dogmatism. The early millennial left took itself seriously enough to critically reflect on its own activity, on its own conditions of possibility, on the categories it adopted, on the history of the left. And all of this authorized Platypus. During my involvement in the imperialism reading group and the process of writing this teach-in, I struggled to identify what was motivating these activities. The existing left has long since discarded its pretensions to intellectual openness and critical self-reflection, to say nothing of its disdain for Marxism, thus raising the question of how Platypus can continue to learn from it, negatively, symptomatically. The recent shifts toward anti-imperialism surrounding the student encampments for Palestine, or the reactions to Trump's comments about annexing Greenland, Canada, etc., simply do not, of their own accord, raise the problem of the left or Marxism. The realization that Marxism not only had nothing to contribute to the Palestinian liberation movement, but was an active impediment to the movement, was perhaps the most significant sentiment that we in Platypus highlighted through our activity around the encampments last year. The millennial left has returned to its anti-imperialist roots, but in the process has lost sight of the fundamental issue it was meant to, if not overcome, then at least recognize and work through. As others have pointed out, the source of the, by now years-long, anxiety over the continued relevance of Platypus in a post-millennial left world can be traced all the way back to 2008, when the millennials threw their lot in with Obama. This signaled the end of the so-called first phase of the millennial left and ushered in what we in Platypus call the downturn of the second phase, as a result of which, as Spencer Leonard put it, quote, Platypus came out of the closet as Marxist. Platypus took up the left's depoliticized turn to hard Marxism and Das Kapital reading groups and focused on developing its internal pedagogy around Marxism, taking on a distinctly intellectual character that wasn't really true of the first phase. Throughout the imperialism reading group, I couldn't help but get the feeling that Platypus has, in many respects, returned to the pedagogical, perhaps even scholastic focus of the second phase, but under much changed circumstances. In 2008, with our Marxological turn, we were in lockstep with the left, which was actually then raising Marxism. Today, we feel more like the only Marxists left in the room. But I don't think this means we need to throw out our pedagogy. Perhaps what is actually needed is a more direct engagement with the millennial left through our pedagogy. Such a change in focus would register the undeniable fact that our pedagogy around historical Marxism doesn't only shed light on the failures of the old and new left, but also, in an increasing measure, those of the millennial left. The millennials once recognized that the categories of Marxism could not be appropriated uncritically. Yet the Zoomers and their millennial teachers seem primed to liquidate this insight and instead rehearse slogans and jargon that have been emptied of their original meaning. This represents an active attempt to prevent the ability of the new generation of leftists to learn from their elders' mistakes. And perhaps there is no category that's remained such an obstacle to critical thinking than imperialism. The millennial left is dead, but platypus remains necessary.
Maybe I am curious about something because, well, first of all, this trying to track the relevance of imperialism nowadays, based on the repetition, the more degraded forms of repetitions of the same moment of recognition of imperialism. This is very interesting. What I wanted to ask was, so, you were saying one of the things about the millennial left, or one of their critical points was, raising the question of the left, raising the question of Marxism. And then you said, maybe this is not, I guess the argument was, well, maybe now the left is still using the terminology of imperialism, but now devoid of even the question of the left or Marxism. And so I guess that it's all, well, there is someone that is, right? Black is raising this. In the left in Marxism. So I don't know, I guess can you just talk more about this critical role of platypus? If platypus is the one that is raising the question of the left, what does that mean?
I guess this is kind of a similar track to a lot of the conversations you and I have been having recently. I'd maybe throw something you said at me back to you, which is, maybe we don't know, but we can't simply throw it all away, because that would be relinquishing the only activity that's making that's making working through the problem possible in the first place, right? In other words, I don't know how this teaching is going to be received, but I know that there's young students, and they might know nothing about the left, but they're learning something about the left through me, and I don't know, that activity in itself is important, right? I feel like there might be a way that us in Platypus, we kind of romanticize the millennial left, or which maybe my teaching is a good example of, and we kind of are overly stressing the point that the left doesn't exist today, that like we're not getting the same questions about the left that we once were. The left itself is no longer constituting an object worthy of reflection and critique. But the phrases are still being thrown around. Marx, people came to this teaching. People want to know about Marx, and it's not a dead dog, subjectively or objectively. Maybe it's more of a dead dog than it was, but that's what we got to work through. I don't have the answers, obviously, because that was.
Do you think, like, where we are now is different to, let's say, pre-millennial left? As in, like, the time period, let's say, before kind of the big upsurge in, say, activity, let's say, and we, like, the defiance of the millennial left and, like, the end of the new left?
The question of whether the millennial left actually ever amounted to anything. Whether it wasn't either just the debased repetition of the new left, or never rose above the post-political, anti-political, post-political left, right? I mean, that's a serious question. But I'm sitting here in this room as a member of Platypus, and we certainly didn't exist in the post-political left. I mean, this is the wonderful thesis of Pam's teaching, that, maybe Platypus is at a different temporal scale, realization of the aspirations of the millennial left. And how can we just throw that away?
As in, it's like anticipatory of it?
No, it certainly came out of the millennial left, but maybe we realized what they were saying.
Before they did?
Yeah, they seem to have reneged on what they were saying. They seem to have kind of thrown it all away, maybe.
So, like in the end, when you're asking for like this further engagement with the millennial left, like what exactly? Can you just?
Right. I think it actually is a. I'm not. That wasn't really a normative statement so much as it was kind of a reflection of a tendency that's already happening. In other words, that. I think a lot of the recent teach-ins and panels that Platypus has done have been about the question of the origins and the aspirations and ideals of the millennial left, and that we're already kind of through our pedagogy raising them as an object to the new Zoomer generation. It was pitched at that level. I mean, we're already doing it, right? And the millennials are also trying to do it, but they're not doing it as self-consciously, right? In other words, they are giving the Zoomers a abridged history of their own history. But I think it's repressing a lot, it's forgetting a lot, and it's disorienting. It's disillusioning and disorientating for the new generation. Right. Such that the only thing that the new generation of leftists seem to produce is counter-identifications with the whole of the millennial left. Right.
I thought it was interesting what you said about the Palestine protests as well. About how that avowedly sort of anti-Marxist in a way. Not necessarily anti-Marxist, but isn't, I think I've been experienced here going to some of the meetings. There was even an expression of, there's no politics to this at all. As in, and I remember there were some people like were walking around a camera and stuff, and they made sure very explicit like that. This is not a left. This is not part of the left at all. And I remember there was a guy who's there, part of some I don't know, the Communist Party of France or something like this, like with a flag or something, and he got told to go away. Right. So it's not even like a rejection of Marxism; it's a rejection of anything. Of even anything political, or even like you could characterize it as the left in quotation marks.
But I think that was more just in an effort to get as many people.
Of course. But I think it's interesting to think that as in the fact that the goal there is just the left is like in their eyes a bad way to get forward whatever their motion is, right?
Yeah.
That in itself is interesting.
But I think it's just a recognition of the levels of divide which exist, like that they're aware that so many people that support the same issue could be so divided on other issues.
Of course,
so
yeah.
I think it's maybe less of a statement of like rejection and more of an acknowledgement of the divisions that exist. Is how I interpret it.
Yeah, but I guess like not engaging with it again, like when you do have to come to the decisive point of okay, now like what is the solution we want in the short term and long term? If you just don't engage with the fact that there are like these solutions, then you don't breed a politics and a solution.
No, I mean I agree.
Because we just don't engage. Yeah.
I do not think that it's the right thing to do. Yeah, and it certainly, as you mentioned before, is proposing no solution or no envisioning of a different future. So I'm not saying it's right, but I do think that proposing that as like an example of overall left, Gen Z left rejection of politics is a step too far.
But I would say like this is, I think, a moment of let's say crisis in the world, right? And usually responses to this have a political form.
Yeah.
And the response to this has been avowedly anti-political. Right? Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm not saying like that they directly are saying that they're anti-left, but as in it's, for them like this is just a tactic. I'm sure many of the people who are organising were members of the left, and for them it's just a tactic. But I think it's interesting to think that it is a tactic. Like the fact that it's a tactic is interesting in the first place.
Yeah, I think like the idea that purely an engagement is somehow an act of politics is kind of like like when it comes down to like the hard task of actually putting something forward, then it just like obfuscates and muddles the issue. Like, you have to do more than just like engagement and visibility, and there I guess like the Gen Z tendency to like just work out the details as well, as opposed to just like getting people to be on either side of something is perhaps lacking.
I'm just curious. It's Josephine. So what would you like? What do you see as the Gen Z politics?
I mean, talking generally, there's no general statement to be made. I mean, I think in terms of the left particularly, I think, and this is very much off of personal observation rather than study, but it's empty, and it comes with a lot of terminology that has Marxist roots, that is not defined by the people that are using the terminology, whether internally or externally, and they just become labels, like placed on, and this is because it's easy to post on social media. And so a lot of what you said before, that this politics, in my opinion, is developing as like a reactionary politics rather than something with any substance in and of itself. It is also because it's an easy way to get engagement, so it stays on the surface level and stays on the social media kind of level of terminology and understanding. And so I have a lot of difficulty seeing any depth beyond that. But I mean, this is also the younger Gen Z. I'm not also Gen Z, but I'm talking about like, after 2000s.
Well, I guess I was asking just because then why do you think it is a step too far, like this
Only because I think, I do agree with the overall sentiment, but I just think that in the case of like the Palestine protests particularly, people I think were viewing this more as like as a humanitarian issue, which then is separate of politics, because, you know, a human independent of your politics, you should be against genocide. And then that large statement was just used to mobilize as many people as possible, even though the people that were participating were largely on the left anyway. So anyway, I just don't think that case is like totally representative of where the politics is coming from. I think it was more of a tool in that.
Yeah, because as in like at the time as well, like the government, Pécresse was doing these things specifically towards Sciences Po because of their encampments there, because it was the leftists at Sciences Po, no? Right? And so because of the leftists were doing these encampments, and I think that was probably...
And it's the same in the States.
Exactly.
And exactly, it's a way...
So like detaching yourself from the idea of politics.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's a way of shirking, like, eliminating that as a basis for blame. As soon as you have a flag, as soon as you have a symbol, it's hard to... But
I think that's just, it's just almost like a sign of defeat in a way. I mean, like another one, let's just say.
Yeah, I agree. It's submission.
Yeah. The fact you have to hide from that.
Yeah.
Because I wonder, let's say like the Palestine protests that were happening in, let's say like the 70s or 80s in the US. I mean, like, did they have this similar anti-political tinge to it, or is that something that's more new?
Who? Are we talking about the New Left?
I guess, yeah. I mean, so just like add on that, was like, for example, May '68. I mean, that was avowedly left, like on the left, right?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. So even since '68, there's been changes in the way that, let's say, like mass protest movements have been characterized.
100%. I mean, the formative experience of the Millennial left in the Iraq War was under much changed circumstances than the New Left, Vietnam anti-war movement, right? You could list a whole bunch of differences, but a primary one was, it by its very nature had a political character to it, in the sense that one could. This is what Moïse Postone talks about in History and Helplessness. It was a great essay published at the founding moment of Platypus on the limits of anti-imperialism. Postone says, the anti-Vietnam War protesters, they weren't just anti-American, but they could claim to be fighting on the behalf of progressive social forces in Vietnam, right? Namely, the Communist Party in Vietnam, which, they'd either fall on the side of, oh yes, they're progressive because they're with the Soviet Union, but they didn't necessarily need to do that, right? They could say they're just in an alliance of convenience with the Soviet Union, and they're still progressive, but there was this kind of, direct link to the politics of the country where, America is doing these things that we're protesting against. Here, in the Iraq War protests, you really couldn't say the same thing, right? I mean, who are our actors on the ground that are progressive? Right? The Iraqi Communist Party was not allowed to speak at anti-war demonstrations in the United States and elsewhere, right? Because they were seen as kind of stooges of American imperialism. So it wasn't necessarily the anti-war movement itself, it was the critique, it was the reflection on the anti-war movement, right? And the limits of anti-imperialism that I think is the birth of the Millennial left, right? I mean, it's not like, because otherwise it could have just been the rehearsal of the worst of the new left and the worst of the post-political left. It was the fact that all these millennials who were being politicized, they didn't necessarily all just go with the flow, right? They weren't all just open to parroting, the ISO's line or something. There was a felt need on the part of the students, but also on the part of the teachers, right? So like this new SDS formation, right? It's one of its founding meetings, maybe its convention even, I'm not sure about the details. Platypus people attended it, and you literally had like old new leftists saying to these students who were refounding SDS, right, the new SDS, like, don't make the mistakes that we did. Right? So there was a felt need on the older and the newer generation that we can't just repeat history.
Yeah, I wonder if like the same, like not choosing, like, people who decide these protests in certain ways, like the lack of learning from millennial left movements, that these sort of like concessionary stances to make it that seem like they would get more people engaged, and that would somehow drive, or eventually like you can figure the politics out later once that we have taken this concessionary stance that it doesn't necessarily work is like it's like a lesson that needs to be learned, because like when someone resorts to something like, oh, it's a humanitarian issue, maybe there's like no recognition of the fact that carrying about the humanity of like certain groups and all of this, like this fact, this took a lot of political work, like it's not like without the politics, this is not like it's the other way around. It's not that like you say it's humanitarian issue that people care, you need to have like you need to take the non-concessionary stance, then you get something out of it as opposed to figuring it out later.
Right. In other words, it's a total denial of one's responsibility, right? To politically take responsibility for whatever one is, advocating for, right? If we're not going to talk about politics, then all this really is like a protest on the ruling classes, the ruling parties, the Democratic Party, to take care of our issues for us. Right? We're going to scream loud enough so the people in the room can hear us. We're not going to do it ourselves. Why? Because it's messy. Right? Then we might actually have political disagreements.
Meanwhile, all of these things will be taken up by someone else, like Trump. Someone's going to take it up. Someone will make the revolution, just a different kind of revolution.
Yeah, and I guess it's also like, it's like, especially with Trump, like they did Project 2025 before he came into office. Like they laid out exactly what the politics they wanted was before, like, and they like, obviously they like kept it hidden, but like somehow they seem to have figured out that like, you need to like have all of this stuff. Like they seem to remember that you need to have this consideration, celebration about like
the right is more than the left.
Yeah. The organized right happened.
Right. It's a farcical repetition of the long trajectory of the New Left, where a lot of the discontents that the New Left brings about, tries to organize, is carried through by the right. Reagan, Thatcher, etc. I don't know if the millennials can quite say the I don't know if they, again, it's a question if they ever really were serious about politics enough so that we could tell the story that Trump carried through their political agenda, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess you can maybe see it in the sense of like the trajectory of, say, like voters voting for Bernie Sanders going over to vote for Trump, in a way, right? As in, just on presidential politics, right?
Yeah.
He was, I guess, the flag. Once Bernie Sanders was away, he lost. Like he was kind of became the flag bearer of a new kind of politics, right?
Right.
So maybe let's say not taking directly, let's say, like the qualms, but definitely taking the place of the left, of the Millennial left.
Right. It's no coincidence maybe that Trump positioned himself as the anti-war candidate both 3 elections over. Right. And where's the Millennial left founded if not in the anti-war movement?
No, and I remember the quote you had like right at the beginning. It was like, that was socialist, and
Right.
that was the socialist call.
Right.
Peace, because or the liberal call, liberal socialist call, you need peace for liberalism. Like the war imperial, like you said, imperialism contradicts liberalism. And, Trump had a recognition of that.
Sure. Sure.
And maybe maybe I'm just talking about Marx here, but it's that kind of trend of depoliticizing big topics that were sort of brought into action or into debate by the left, right? And today you see them still their remnants, but in like a completely depoliticized form.
Starting even with the Civil War of Marxism.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I see the same trend of it's a submission to this recognition. There's a larger force. We can't/don't want to fight it, so we bend ourselves until we're modifying this force instead of bringing our own new thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
I even
what's depolitical about it? Like you said, these discontents still exist, but in a depoliticized form. Like on the left, they exist in a depoliticized form, or in general,
in general.
Is the kind of Trumpian transformation of politics not political? In a sense, maybe not. Right?
Yeah, I think, but maybe that's not what you're saying. But then if you take the left, for example, and as Coco was just saying, the reality of an organized right, and then we have the left who is at the same time putting on Palestine protests and saying that it's a depolitical organization, then it's this kind of like self-fulfilling thing where no one on the left is investing time in the actual politicization. They're actually denying it in this cycle of submission to, in which time, I don't think you're saying that the Trump side is depolitical. I think it's just the left is continuing to depoliticize itself, and this is allowing the right to always kind of,
Yes.
or not the right.
Okay.
I feel like these discontents have been brought in by the left, and then they sort of said, okay, we want nothing to do with them, and then the right kind of takes them up, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. If you put people in like this concessionary position, then someone who isn't in a concessionary position, who doesn't have like a concessionary position, can then like move in to take these individuals because they're already operating in this like concessionary. We're going to
This is literally the history he was talking
Yeah,
about,
exactly.
bonapartism, like in
Yeah.
1848. Like that's
Yeah.
literally like still this.
Yeah. It's the spiral in the previous
Yes, exactly,
lecture.
exactly.
Right. Although, of course, the cycles of Bonapartism, imperialism in the 18th and 19th century were, the 19th and 20th centuries, early 20th century was understood to be the eve of revolution.
Mm.
I guess.
No, I was just gonna say because I mean this whole teaching and I'm just thinking about like the irrelevance of imperialism.
Right.
So,
Right. Exactly. The revolution is happening, but not in the way that Lenin can talk about imperialism as being the eve of revolution.
Mm.
And yet we host these panels and all these leftists get up to speak and they're like, yeah, 1917, 2025, what's the difference here?
Mm.
and those are the teachers of the millennial left and the Gen Z left.
Right. To call it?
Yeah.
Yeah.